The Black Death was one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, sweeping across Europe in the mid-14th century and leaving a trail of unimaginable suffering and death. It arrived with terrifying speed, spreading through cities and countryside alike, reshaping societies, economies, and belief systems. The disease is believed to have originated in the plains of Central Asia, where it thrived in the rodent population. Carried by fleas living on rats, the plague traveled along the trade routes that connected the east to the west, following merchants and soldiers across continents. By the early 1340s, it had reached the Crimean Peninsula, where Mongol armies besieging the city of Kaffa reportedly catapulted plague-infected corpses over the walls. From there, Italian merchants fleeing the city brought the infection to Europe, landing in Sicily in 1347. Within months, the plague began to spread like wildfire. The disease struck with terrifying symptoms. Victims would often experience sudden chills, fever, and vomiting. Swollen lymph nodes, called buboes, appeared in the groin, armpits, and neck, turning black and oozing pus. This form of the disease, known as bubonic plague, was the most common. In some cases, the infection spread to the bloodstream, causing septicemic plague, which led to rapid death without visible buboes. When the bacteria infected the lungs, it became pneumonic plague, spreading through the air and causing almost certain death within days. Without any understanding of germ theory, medieval physicians were helpless to stop the spread. Remedies ranged from bloodletting and herbal concoctions to more desperate measures like self-flagellation, where groups of people would whip themselves in the belief that their suffering would atone for humanity's sins and stop the plague. The speed and scale of the pandemic were unlike anything Europe had experienced. In just a few years, the Black Death claimed the lives of an estimated 25 to 50 million people, approximately one-third to half of Europe's population. Entire villages were wiped off the map. Mass graves were dug to accommodate the overwhelming number of bodies. Cities like Florence, Paris, and London became ghost towns, filled with the stench of death. Survivors often abandoned their sick family members, terrified of infection. The social order began to unravel as fear and suspicion spread. People sought explanations for the catastrophe in religion, astrology, and superstition. Some believed the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins. Others blamed marginalized groups, particularly Jewish communities, accusing them of poisoning wells. These unfounded accusations led to horrific pogroms where thousands of Jews were tortured and killed across Europe. The economic consequences of the Black Death were profound. With a significant portion of the working population dead, labor became scarce. Serfs and peasants, who had previously been bound to the land by feudal lords, found new bargaining power. Wages rose, and many peasants demanded better living conditions. This shift in the balance of power between the upper and lower classes weakened the feudal system that had dominated Europe for centuries. Agricultural production plummeted, leading to food shortages and higher prices. At the same time, abandoned farms and vacant lands became available for surviving peasants to cultivate, improving their quality of life in the years that followed. The wealthiest survivors inherited vast estates, while others took advantage of new opportunities to move to cities and join emerging trades. The cultural and psychological impact of the Black Death cannot be overstated. The omnipresence of death inspired a fixation on mortality and the afterlife, which was reflected in art and literature. The macabre imagery of skeletons dancing with the living, known as the danse macabre, became a common motif, reminding people of the fragility of life and the inevitability of death. Writers such as Giovanni Boccaccio chronicled the horrors of the plague in works like the Decameron, which described a group of young people fleeing Florence to escape the pestilence. Religious institutions faced both a spiritual and practical crisis. Clergy members who tended to the sick often became infected themselves, leading to a shortage of priests. Faith in the church wavered as people questioned why a just and merciful God would allow such devastation. In some cases, this disillusionment led to the rise of new religious movements and a re-evaluation of spiritual beliefs. The long-term effects of the Black Death were far-reaching and transformative. In the aftermath of the pandemic, Europe underwent profound social, economic, and cultural changes that shaped the course of history. One of the most immediate effects was a dramatic shift in the population structure. With millions dead, the labor force was decimated, creating a power vacuum that allowed surviving workers to demand better wages and living conditions. This shift contributed to the gradual decline of the medieval feudal system, where peasants were tied to the land under the control of feudal lords. Many peasants gained their freedom or moved to urban centers in search of better opportunities, accelerating the growth of towns and cities. The scarcity of labor also spurred technological innovation, as landowners sought new methods to maximize agricultural productivity with fewer workers. This period saw the increased use of plows, water mills, and crop rotation techniques that improved food production over time. The economic landscape of Europe was irrevocably altered. With fewer people to consume goods, the demand for products decreased, leading to deflation and a collapse of many markets. However, for those who survived, the redistribution of wealth improved living standards. Surviving peasants acquired abandoned lands, while merchants and artisans found new markets to exploit. The newfound economic mobility allowed for the emergence of a prosperous middle class in several regions. In some areas, the reduction of competition for resources led to a higher quality of life, better diets, and improved health outcomes for future generations. This shift in economic power dynamics planted the seeds for the Renaissance, a period of cultural and intellectual flourishing that emerged in the decades following the plague. The Black Death also had profound psychological and cultural consequences. The constant presence of death fostered an obsession with mortality and the afterlife. Artistic expressions during this period reflected the trauma and uncertainty people experienced. Paintings and sculptures frequently depicted themes of death and the transience of life. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a recurring motif symbolizing the inevitability of death for people of all social classes. Literature captured the horror and human response to the plague. Works such as Boccaccio's The Decameron provided vivid accounts of the social upheaval caused by the pandemic. While chroniclers documented the breakdown of social norms and the desperate measures people took to survive, religion, which had once been a pillar of medieval life, was also deeply affected. As the plague ravaged communities, many clergy members died while tending to the sick. This loss of spiritual leaders weakened the church's authority and created a crisis of faith. People questioned why divine intervention had not spared the faithful and began to seek alternative spiritual practices. This skepticism laid the groundwork for religious reform movements that would eventually culminate in the Protestant Reformation. In some regions, the failure of the Church to provide answers or relief from the plague led to the rise of radical religious sects and new interpretations of Christian doctrine. Meanwhile, flagellant movements, where people publicly whipped themselves to atone for humanity's sins, spread across Europe in response to the belief that the plague was divine punishment. The Black Death also reshaped Europe's relationship with disease and public health. The sheer scale of the pandemic forced governments and communities to develop new approaches to managing outbreaks. Quarantine practices were formalized, with cities like Venice establishing dedicated quarantine stations to isolate infected individuals. The term quarantine itself originates from the Italian word quaranta, meaning 40, referring to the 40-day isolation period imposed on ships arriving from plague-infected regions. These early public health measures laid the foundation for modern epidemiology and disease control practices. Despite the catastrophic loss of life, the Black Death ultimately accelerated changes that would propel Europe toward modernity. The breakdown of rigid social hierarchies, the questioning of religious authority, and the reorganization of economic structures fostered an environment of innovation and progress. By the end of the 14th century, Europe was on the cusp of a new age. The trauma of the plague had shaken the old order to its core, but it also cleared the way for the emergence of new ideas, scientific inquiry, and artistic achievement. The legacy of the Black Death endures as a testament to both the resilience and the vulnerability of human societies in the face of existential threats.